super happy to be here today with Armand Farrokh and Nick Cegelski, co-founders of 30 Minutes to President's Club, an incredible sales media company renowned for its no-nonsense, tactical approach to sales training, and might I add, some entertaining light banter between the two of you also. But Nick and Armand are not just media experts, they're actual operators. So Armand has a rich background in sales leadership, having served as VP of sales at Pave. And Nick has extensive experience across top enterprise selling and companies, having closed 6- and 7-figure deals. We were actually just chatting before we went live here about some of his past trips over to Vancouver and the territory that he was running here. So welcome, Nick, Armand. How are you both today?
I'm excited. This is going to be a good one. We're getting to talk about cold calling today, which is everybody's favorite activity. So I'm pumped. This is going to be a really good one. I appreciate all the prep you did for this Sophie. I know we were jamming before people came in.
What I would also love to hear from the audience is we got people from all over the world. We got people from Vancouver, Canada, someone in Jersey, someone in India, someone in Florida, someone in Ann Arbor. And there are a million different lenses that we could cover on cold calling, and we have an awesome run of the show. But if we were to answer one burning question about cold calling, whether it's for reps, whether it's for leaders, whatever it is, what would that question be? You can drop it in the Q&A box. Let's seed that Q&A box with a solid like 10 questions at the beginning, because I want to make sure that we go on the fly and we tailor the session to everyone in the room. I think we're ready to rock.
I love it. Ready to rock. I got my eyes on the chat for any kind of burning questions, so throw them in there. And while we look for those questions in there, Armand, Nick, we're going to jump into benchmarks, details, but 30 Minutes to President's Club is a media company. You've had tremendous growth and success, and you've also been working on a book. It launches August 14th. I know because I am patiently waiting on the pre-order. Can you share a little bit about the journey behind 30 Minutes to President's Club and the inspiration behind writing this book?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so Armand and I both spent a long time working in tech sales, and a little bit of background. Armand and I were also college wrestling training partners. So we went from like beating each other up on a wrestling match to beating each other up in sales, but really collaborating on best practices. Armand was a VP of sales up in the Bay Area, and I was an enterprise rep in Southern California. And he and I would always share like, what subject line's working for you? What are you saying on cold calls nowadays? And we didn't feel like there was a really great resource out there that gave people actionable, practical, usable stuff in sales. There's a lot of sales content around what to do and why to do it. Things like, you got to have a great cold call opener. You got to be a great listener. You got to sell value. But there wasn't a, hey, here's how to do it. And so I think the promise that we have for the audience today is like the same thing for why we started 30 MPC, the same reason we wrote this book. We're going to give you actionable, practical, tactical stuff. So you should get talk tracks and scripts and tonality best practices. Like, we're going to get into the nitty gritty today.
I love it. I love it. Brilliant. Well, first and foremost, I've heard you both speak about how cold calling can only suck if you suck at it. Yeah. Can you share some kind of overall benchmarks like connect rates, set rates, and show rates? Like, how do you know if you actually suck at it in a way so that people can measure their cold calling effectiveness?
So while I ask you, Sophie, could you enable screen sharing really quickly in the session? I think you could do it if you just hover over the share screen button. For everyone in the chat, I want you to guess. Someone cold calls 1 hour per day for an entire month. 1 hour per day for an entire month. That gets you 800 cold calls. How many meetings do you think the average rep books off 800 cold calls? Put it in the chat. Let's see. What do we got? 5, 10, 10%, 15, 42.
42.
Wow. Tim's got the best reps in the world. Amazing. Sophie, I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you think?
I think Gabriella might be on track here.
All right. So the reason people constantly claim cold calling is dead is because their numbers look like this. Is the average rep off of 800 cold calls, they have an average 5.4% connect rate. That means you make 100 cold calls, you talk to 5 people. You make 800 cold calls, you talk to 43 people. You book 2 meetings off of it. That is the biggest waste of time I've ever heard in my life. But if you're a top quartile rep, this is not top 10%. Top 10% actually book even more. Top quartile rep, same 800 dials. you get 106 connects. And we're going to talk in this session today about ways to boost your connect rate, ways to boost your set rate, ways to boost your show rate. On those same 106, on those same $800, 106 conversations, 18 meetings versus 2 meetings. So they book 16.7% of those conversations and turn those into meetings. So the difference between an average rep and a top rep is similar to the difference between the top startups and the bottom startups. It's a power law. They either go all the way to the moon or they fail. And what you'll find is that it's actually not that hard to beat the average when you look at the way the average rep typically opens a call asking, how's your day going? Or did I catch you at a bad time? Or doing certain things that immediately trigger the telemarketer mindset within the first 5 seconds of a call. So I thought it'd be helpful to share that data live.
Extremely helpful. Thank you. And I mean, getting reps to actually pick up the phone to make those cold calls and increase the ratios can be challenging due to reluctance. And you've both mentioned, tactics like the 10 dials, no P rule as ways to overcome this. Can you share more strategies for overcoming call reluctance and methods that you've used or seen work to overcome call reluctance?
Yeah, I mean, and I want to start with the name of our book is literally Cold Calling Sucks, and that's why it works. And I want to be really, really clear with the people here. We're going to talk about stuff to improve connect rate, book more meetings, etc. But no matter how good you get at cold calling, even the best rep, like Armand, they make 800 dials, they book something like 20 meetings. When they get somebody on the phone, they book like 1 in 4, even the best 1 in 3 meetings, which means even if you're really, really good, you still lose more than you win. And so no matter how good you get at cold calling, you're still going to get shut down by prospects. You're still going to deal with the monotony of hitting voicemail, 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 voicemail. You're still going to get rejected by gatekeepers. That stuff's not going to go away. But actually, that's your advantage if you commit to consistently picking up the phone, because the suck of cold calling gets a lot of reps to stop doing it and make them focus on stuff like, let me Uber personalize my emails, or let me send out a bunch of crummy like AI generated spam that isn't really going to get me anything, or let me try social selling more. Cold calling, when done right, is still the fastest way to a conversation with a prospect who can actually buy something from you. So we're not going to get rid of the suck, but there are things that you can do to get over that reluctance. First, accept it. Second, and this is the biggest one, do it first thing in the morning. We looked at some data in terms of connect rates. We partnered with Gong in doing this book, and we looked at over 300 million cold calls. And we saw, shocker, connect rates are highest in the morning. But even if they weren't, the best way to get in the habit of cold calling and make sure that it gets done every single day, thank you, Armand, is by doing it first thing in the morning. You referenced the 10 dial no P rule, Sophie, which is literally something that I did when I was a new sales rep, where when I would get into the office, I literally wouldn't let myself go to the bathroom until I had made 10 cold calls, with the intent of creating this artificial motivation for myself where I would run to my desk. I'd have all my calls already prepared because I didn't want to be researching people while I had to go to the bathroom. I would do my 10 dials. I would break the seal of the discomfort of cold calling. Then I would go to the bathroom. Then I would come back and make the rest of my calls. And when you get in that habit of doing it first thing in the morning, it creates this virtuous cycle where the rest of the day is easier from there. So that's my big recommendation, is like create artificial deadlines, do it first thing in the morning. Also accept it's not going to be easy. Armand, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the other things in terms of managing calendars and day, but that might be enough for
I think that's a good starting point.
Cool.
Do it first thing in the morning, block the time, and accept the fact that you have to eat the worst part of the day first.
And how would you recommend sales leaders specifically communicate this or help empower their sales reps to actually implement this? Because a lot of it is, relying on self-motivation around not going to the washroom until you make 10 calls and things like that. From a sales leader perspective, what's the best way to actually enable these sales reps?
Yeah. This is where it starts to get fun. I think sales leaders are terrified to look their reps in the eye today and tell them that cold calling is worth it. And so what they do is they try to be like, did you make your dials this week? Or, maybe you should pick up the phone. You made 42 cold calls on the week. Good job. Can you do 43 next week? And I'm like, this is a bunch of nonsense, folks. The other day I was coaching an SDR, and I do some advisory work for founders who have early stage sales teams. And the SDR gets on the call and he's reaching out to 10 accounts, 15 accounts per week. And he made 60 cold calls. And he didn't connect with anyone. He's like, I made 60 calls, didn't really work. And I was like, cool. There's this assumption that like everyone's working at maximum capacity. I was like, great. Can we do 150 next week? And he sort of looked at me and his eyes bulged. I was like, 150? I was like, yeah, I think you could do 150. He's like, what do you mean? I was like, well, pull up your calendar. I was like, okay, cool. So first thing, like you're doing your call prep in the morning. That's when you have the most energy. You're taking a bunch of one-on-ones in the early afternoon. I want you to take all of that stuff, move it to the end of the day. Every single. You're not allowed to do anything until you hit your prospecting goal before noon. So move it to past 3 p.m. Cool. Now we know where it lives on your calendar. First thing you do in the day, you get 30 minutes to time block and check your inbox at 8:30 a.m. 9 a.m. You will hit 200 cold calls in a week. From there, every single week in the Monday morning meeting, I would pull up a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet had 3 columns on it. How many accounts did you work net new? How many cold calls did you make? And how many meetings did you book? And then on the last column, it had a commitment that you'd put in front of the entire team. And so now you have an entire leaderboard that shows how many dials everyone is making, how many meetings they're booking off those dials. And it looks really weird to put up the 2 dial 0 meeting special. Have the hard conversations with your reps and don't be afraid to ask them to cold call.
Nathan had a question in the chat, which is, would like to hear how you're building a list to support the volume that you're describing. And one of the things that I would add to what you shared, Armand, is you've got to separate the execution of the dials from the building of the list and doing of the research. Where things go wrong is where you're constantly context switching between research, find prospect, get contact information, make a cold call. Research, find contact information, prepare for a call, make a dial. Bouncing back and forth like that is really, really inefficient. And it also means you're like lingering in this sort of funky like research / call block mindset for way too long. You are better off operationalizing this where the building of the list happens Monday afternoon. The calling of that list happens Tuesday morning. The building for Wednesday's calls comes Tuesday afternoon. So you're constantly building dial inventory separate from when you're executing on the prospecting activity.
Bingo.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And someone just asked a great question in the chat. Are you taking questions from the chat box or from the Q&A box? And the answer is both. So feel free to pop them in anywhere. We have a ton of them, so we're going to work them through as we go.
Yep.
But that brings us to the call itself.
Mm-hmm.
So you've broken down frameworks, in the past, like the 5-minute drill and PPO and past interviews, so forth. What would be that kind of minimum viable cold call playbook? What does that look like for sales reps and sales teams, and how do they actually build one effectively? And I know that's a loaded question, but if we think about the ultimate playbook, what is that minimum viable playbook?
Let's do it. 3 parts. And one thing you'll get with us and throughout the book, everything can be broken down into 3 steps. So the 3 parts of a cold call: opener, the problem proposition, which is how you just describe the product that you sell, and then objections. And I think it's apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. Sagar, you asked about how do you win back the conversation if it's lost in the first 10 seconds. The key thing is you need to lead with something that does not lose someone in the first 10 seconds. So let's start with step 1, and Sophie, we can pause after each step, and then we can walk through 2 and 3. Step 1 is minimum viable cold call opener. I'm not even going to talk about all the reasons why how's your day going is a horrible opener, or did I catch it at a bad time is a good opener or a bad opener, or even the permission-based opener, which is, can I get 30 seconds to tell you why I called, and then you can tell me if it's a fit, why all of those are good or bad openers. The reason they're actually all bad openers is because they're canned. Even if you believe that the permission-based cold call opener today is a good cold call opener, it doesn't matter, because once it gets popular, everyone starts using it. And when you pick up the phone and someone has heard that cold call opener 3 or 4 other times in the last week, they immediately categorize you in with all of the other telemarketers and they hang up the phone. So if you can master one thing on your cold call opener, is it's not to lead with a pleasantry, like how's your day going, not to lead with a permission-based opener, not to lead with your name and your company, but to lead with an opener that can't be canned. And that means you lead with context that you know about them. So Sophie, if I was cold calling you, and if I said, hey, Sophie, this is Armand from Acme Co. How's your day going? Do you know it's a cold call?
Oh yeah.
Like,
Automatic trigger.
you know it's a cold call. You and
I
I
got
both
one
know
this morning.
it's a
Yeah.
cold call. But if I say, hey, Sophie, we work with the guys over at 30 Minutes to President's Club. We know Armand and Nick. It's Bill from Acme Co. Have you heard our name tossed around? Even if you haven't heard our name tossed around, you're going to be like, well, we're literally doing a webinar with them. I know those guys. Even if I haven't heard your name tossed around, I'm not going to be a complete jerk to you, even if I don't want the cold call. It completely changes the tenor of the call from the beginning. Nick, you can give your version of that as well, is you can still use the permission-based opener, but listen to the twist when you just add context to the front end of it.
Right. So I use what's called a tailored permission opener, which might sound something like you answer the phone and you go, hello. And I'm going to go, Sophie, I just finished reading your state of sales report that GTM now just put out. And I'm going to be honest, this is a cold call, but it is a well-researched one. And I'm wondering if I can get half a minute to share why that state of sales report that you put out prompted me to call you in the first place. And then you can totally hang up on me if it doesn't make sense to talk from there. What I'm doing is I am front loading. Hey, I saw this thing about you. This prompted me to call you. Can I tell you why that thing that's unique to you? There aren't other salespeople calling you being like, I read your state of sales report, which is a made up report that I'm pretending that you did, by the way, and saying that. So I'm already setting myself apart. And now what I have to do is connect that state of sales report to whatever I end up pitching later in the call. But it's much more powerful than your generic, hey, can I get 27 seconds to tell you why I called, that every rep is using right now.
That's a great example. Great example. And perhaps we should publish something around the state of sales. No, that's fantastic. And I think that really answers Gemma's question there in chat around giving the example of a really effective cold call opener too. Hyper personalized, showcasing that you've done your research and really earning the respect of their time.
The other thing that I want to share, Sophie, is there had been a question about like, okay, how do I actually do that with supporting the dial volume that Armand was recommending? What you shouldn't be doing is starting from scratch every single time. With Armand's opener, Armand, I know there's a couple like pieces of familiar context that you look for, stuff like common investors, similar geo. Are there other things that you're looking for to make it really easy to have a repeatable opener with that?
The more specific you can get for your industry, the better. So I was selling into venture-backed tech. And so investor was really obvious. We work with a few other Sequoia portfolio companies. I used to cold call partners of law firms. I would say we work with a few other partners in the Skadden LA office. If I was cold calling people leaders in Chicago and we had other clients in Chicago, or if we were doing an event in Chicago, I would say like, hey, we work with a bunch of the other people ops teams out in the Chicago area. It's Armand from Pave. Have you heard her name tossed around? The closer you can get to home, even in real estate, like the literal example would be like, hey, I've listed a few other houses down the block, or my team has listed a few other houses on Bedford Ave. It's Armand from Keller Williams. Have you heard her name tossed around? Those little things just create that close familiarity next door that make you sit up and realize this person's not such a rando.
Right. And you can lean on them again and again and again. You don't have to reinvent that people leaders in Chicago opener every single time, because you know, okay, when you call into Dallas or you call into Rochester or you call into Michigan, that's a state, you can lean on that one again and again and again. So you find repeatability there. With the tailored permission opener, what I would recommend you do is you look for like your top 5 common triggers that would prompt you to call a prospect in the first place. So when I sold billing software to law firms, I would look for things like if they had just opened a new office. Hey, I just finished reading about the new office opening on Smith Street. Do you mind if I take half a minute to share why that prompted me to call you? They opened a new office, usually added billing complexity, which my software could help with. Or if they want a big case, I'd say, hey, I just finished reading about the big antitrust case against Acme. I'm going to be honest, this is a cold call, but do you mind if I share why that had prompted me to call you? So I would look for things that you can commonly find, but then add as context in the front of your opener, or in Armand's case, as a way to establish familiarity.
That's fantastic. And that in itself shows an example around Bujal's question here around he sells to digital marketing. What's an opener? And what I would say from based on what you're saying is it's not industry specific alone. Yes, you can lean on industry, but you can also learn on that person, geolocation. There's a ton of different factors that you can kind of build that opener around and make it personalized.
Yeah, totally.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Now, there's a really interesting question in the chat from Justin. A few other folks have touched on here, and it's, would you recommend calling prospects directly or trying to get them to respond on email, then call? And what I hear in that question is, what is the ideal sequencing of cold calling in the overall outbound approach?
Yeah. All right. So a couple of things to share here. First is it okay if I share my screen? Folks, is it annoying when I share my screen, or is it helpful to have a visual? Put a 1 if it's helpful. Put a 2 if you're like, stop sharing your screen, dude. This is really annoying. Okay, it's helpful. Great.
So far, unanimous
Well, then
ones.
you don't get to look at Nick anymore.
Oh, no.
Lucky you. Alrighty. So first thing, let's just talk about why it's important. The question that was asked, why Justin's question is important, is cold calling will double your email reply rate even if you don't connect. And if you leave voicemails, it goes even higher than that. And so I'll show you this one here. You'll notice it goes even higher if you leave voicemails. And so you have to have your emails and your calls talking to each other, not literally, but figuratively. The way that you actually pull that off is these are usually like the first 3 prospecting batches in your sequence or your cadence or whatever tool you're using. So usually you'll lead with an email. And the reason you lead with an email is that like it's just faster to send emails, and you can usually just like give them a way to reply in the first place. Emails are really just like a place where someone can reply. From there, you use the cold call 2 days later, and then immediately follow that cold call with an email that says, hey, I just left you a voicemail. And that's how you attach your prospecting touch points together. From there, another 3 or 4 days later, you cold call them again, you leave another voicemail, and then you drop the email right afterwards. And so it goes first email, call email, and then call email 2 or 3 more times throughout your sequence. And then eventually you stop cold calling because that becomes a waste of time.
Where you can build this into your operations is you are doing, like we just talked about, doing some degree of prep for your cold call opener. Armand, you're looking up, okay, they're in Chicago, or I'm looking up, did they just win a big case or open a new office? You're already doing that investigation to prep for the cold call. Just insert that into your email using like a trigger template where you can tailor it in very, very quickly. The other powerful thing about this, Armand, is like you'll get like the email bounces, you'll get the, oh, contact moved on a different company. Like you'll get a lot of that noise out of the way where you wouldn't want to waste a dial calorie. That's the other reason I think you should start with an email.
I think we got you on mute.
You're on mute. You're probably saying this is the worst advice I've ever heard. What are you guys doing?
That ends this webinar. Have a nice day.
Yeah, you guys are professional lip readers, I will say. Now, that's amazing though. I mean, the percentages there around voicemail speak for themselves. So if you do hit a voicemail, it sounds like make sure you do leave a voicemail. But what would you recommend for that voicemail? Because often it is a dreaded part of cold calls and having to suddenly be put on the spot. You're preparing for the actual conversation itself. Most of the time you hit that dreaded voicemail. How do you make sure that it's effective? And you've already kind of mentioned how it ties into the overall outbound strategy.
Yeah. So you can take the same piece of context. And the beauty is like, if you're smart about the way you're prospecting, you use that same piece of context that you got for your opener, and you use that in a million different places. So let's just take the example of what I used. Is Sophie, I gave you the example of we work with the guys over at 30 Minutes to President's Club. It's Bill from Acme Co. Have you heard her name tossed around? That's my cold call opener. All I'm going to do for my first voicemail is I'm going to drop context only in the voicemail. And so it's going to be 15 seconds, no pitch. Why is there no pitch? The pitch is in the email. And I'm not going to ask you to call me back in the voicemail. I'm going to ask you to reply to my email. It sounds like this. Hey, Sophie, we work with a few folks over at the 30 Minutes to President's Club team. Armand and Nick, great guys. I saw that you work with them. No need to call me back. I'm literally going to send you an email that gives you a sense of how we work with them. Just so we don't play phone tag, would you mind replying there and letting me know if it's even moderately interesting? It'll come from Bill over at Acme Co. Cheers. So I'm going to use that context, that familiarity of 30 Minutes to President's Club to be like, hey, I know you. I'm not going to do the whole pitch over voicemail thing. I'll send you a note after this. Would you mind letting me know if that's interesting? And then in that email, I will have the context. I work with 30 Minutes to President's Club, the problem I solve for them, and some sort of ask for a meeting. That's where I want them listening to the whole pitch or reading the whole pitch, not in a voicemail.
That makes sense. Makes sense. It's really creating direction. And that goes to Catherine's question around the effectiveness of picking up the phone versus email on a daily basis. And it sounds like it's less of a verse. It's more of how do they complement each other and how can you utilize them to actually redirect for that overall communication?
Yeah, they work in tandem with each other where your prospect's not going to call you back. Like no prospect's going to intentionally put themselves in like a sales conversation right away. It's much lower friction for them to respond on email. And you can also like get their attention on a little bit more detail in that. And so they complement each other. The phone call gets their attention. And if you do connect live, awesome. You have a great opportunity to book a meeting. The email, though, more often is where you'll see, okay, you're going to get some engagement and you'll get a lot of the no's out of the way there also.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And you mentioned, I mean, volume is obviously important. It's always a balancing act between quality and volume, quality and quantity. Now, I'm curious, question around in the chat, how do you motivate a team to actually call more? So from that volume perspective without minimum activity targets. So going back to a little bit more around the parameters of motivating a team and actually kind of empowering those reps. Is there a way that you can motivate them to make more calls without minimum activity targets?
Yeah. Question for the chat. We got sales leaders in the room, I know, and we have reps in the room. Do you believe that there should be minimum activity targets? Say yes. If you believe it's yes, say no. If you do not think teams should have minimum activity targets. Kyle says yes.
Got one, yes.
Ryan says yes. Ash says yes. Yes. No. Minimum results. No. Oh, okay. All the no's started coming. There it is. No, no, no. Yes. Yes.
Quite mixed.
Cool. All right. So it drives me crazy when people have like this binary world of thinking. And here I am asking you a binary question. There are minimum viable activity metrics where can we all agree that if you make 40 cold calls per week, you're not going to get results from it? I think we can all agree you're not going to get results off 40 cold calls. You're going to maybe have 4 conversations at best if your connect rate is really, really good. And if you're outstanding, you might book 2 meetings, which would be a 50% conversion rate, which is I've never seen anyone who has it. So let's all agree that whether or not we want to state a minimum, there is a minimum implicit. The thing where people start to get it wrong is they start to only look at minimums. They start to only look at, did you make $400 this week? $500, $600? And every single sales team I've coached in my life, I've coached over 100 SDRs. I've hired tons of outbound teams. I've never seen that the number one performer has the highest activity on the leaderboard. Never. Never. The highest performer is never the one with the most activity. And so you have to do 2 things. Number 1, you set a minimum viable activity expectation. It's not that crazy to do $150 per week. It's not that crazy. It's not that crazy to do $200 per week. That's 1 hour of cold calling per day. And that is the minimum viable expectation because I want reps getting in the habit of just doing it every day. If you take 1 or 2 days off, it gets really hard to pick it up on the 3rd day. But then once you get to the minimum viable activity expectation, $150, $200, pull the right lever. So if they're making 150 cold calls and booking 0 meetings, don't ask them to make 300 cold calls. Look at their connect rates and see if they're even having conversations. Look at their set rates and see if those conversations are converting to meetings. And if they are, and they want more meetings, then just tell them to do more, right? But usually they're not converting in their connect rates or their set rates. So solve the right problem. And so it can be a volume or a conversion issue. Solve the right problem.
Great advice. Great advice. And we talked about the opener itself of the call. Pre-opener, we had a question around what are you recommending or what are you seeing for best practice for actually gathering that information and gathering the contact data? You'd mentioned previously shifting that time block to later in the day so you can actually maximize your morning slot for the calls themselves. In that research prep block, when you're actually preparing your lists, are there any kind of best practices that you've seen for that process itself?
Yeah. So prospecting is like playing, you ever play the game Guess Who when you were a kid? You know, that board game? Like the
Oh, yeah.
first question you ask, you try to like knock off half the board, and then you try to knock off like another 10% of the board, and then 20%. Like the first question you don't ask is it like the person with the freckles and the glasses and exactly one hair sticking up on their head? It's like you don't ask that question first because that only knocks down one face on the board. And so the way you build your list is like you're playing Guess Who. You build your list in reverse order. And so you start with a list of, we'll call it 50 accounts, right? And that first list, you want to pull a targeted list. For example, when I was at Pave, it would be venture-backed tech companies between 100 and 1,000 employees that hadn't been closed, lost in the last 3 months, and a few other parameters that just were like obvious disqualifiers. Got my 50. From there, I will still have some junk in my list. And so what I want to do is I want to cull all of the DQ accounts. And so I had what was called the 30-second drill. So the 30-second drill was I needed 30 seconds to figure out if I was going to work an account or not. And so I wrote down the 5 disqualifiers for an account at Pave. I couldn't work international accounts. If their website was not functioning, the startup was probably dead. If their employee count was shrinking, they probably were not going to invest in compensation software. And I had a couple of other ones. And I just click path those 5 through all 50 accounts. I'd be like, international, not working. Website test, not working. Employee growth, negative, not working. That gets you to a list of, call it 25, right? So maybe half of them were junk or 30 were junk, whatever. Let's call it 40 just because that number works a little bit more round for the math. From there, 20-10-10. 20-10-10 is how you build your list. Or if you blew this up to 100, it would be 50-25-25. 50% of your accounts, in my experience, are C-tier accounts. They're in your ICP, but there's not anything great about them. Like they're not growing like crazy. There aren't compelling events, all that stuff. For those ones, you're doing like mostly automated outreach type of thing, and you're doing 3 to 4 cold calls. The next 50% of your accounts are split into B tier and A tier accounts. For those ones, add 2 more cold calls a pop. Right? Those are much more likely to buy. The way I differentiate an A tier account from a B tier account is a B tier account is an account that's likely to have the problem that I solve right now, or likely to have the problem that I solve. So for example, at Pave, company was growing 20% year over year. Like they're probably running into compensation problems and scalability issues. They probably have a problem. Solid B tier account. If they have a problem now, that's an A tier account. Like if they're hiring a compensation person and they're growing 20% year over year, or if I know their merit cycle is coming up and they're growing 20% year over year, A tier account. So you prioritize the folks who want to buy now, the folks who want to buy at all, and then your C tiers are the folks who like could buy.
What he's doing is, it's not like these prospects are posting on LinkedIn, I'm looking for compensation planning software, please call me. It's not like they're publishing, I want to buy now. What Armand is doing is reverse engineering the conditions that a company would be under that lead him to believe they could need his product right now. And he's starting with those ones. And so for the folks here who don't sell compensation software, what you need to do is reverse engineer what are the conditions that make a prospect prime for needing your solution today, and start with those ones, because those ones you'll convert more easily on the phone because they're operating under the conditions that give them the problem that you solve. And that's how you actually make bigger progress than like mastering the way you do your pitch or having the slickest opener in the world. The thing that you taught me, Armand, is the best reps do the work off the phones so that the work on the phones is easier and more effective. And that's why they're not the highest on the activity leaderboard, because they're doing more work prepping that list, culling that list, than just closing their eyes and dialing blindly through the phone book.
I like that. That's a great quote too, around quality and quantity. And a common thing, at least we hear, right, from GTM Fund being a VC is, from our portfolio companies, a lot of them get targeted for cold calling based on funding rounds. So that's a common trigger. I would say there's so many different layers to figuring that out. Like one thing I've seen work really effectively is taking the actual closed won and then closed loss and just reverse engineering those factors to actually create that minimum viable factor list, if you will. And then you can layer on more generic ones like funding announcements, because of course that's going to enable growth, but there's actually more strategic ones, like you mentioned, that get into more of the nuanced and can help with that quality targeting.
100%. Don't book meetings for the sake of booking meetings. You want to go and look at the deals that you've won, and then go get more of those as they actually close.
And you nicely gave us some openers, some fantastic examples. What about beyond the opener? Let's say we hooked them with the opener on that call themselves, on the call itself, pardon me. What are some more kind of tactical things? Maybe it's handling objections around agreeing with it, or anything that's going to help us as we get past that initial stage.
Yeah. So why don't we get to the point of the call where once you've gotten past your opener, usually there's a piece before the objection where you have to tell them what you do. Like you have to give them your pitch, basically. And this is one of the bigger areas. Like most salespeople, even when they learn a basic permission-based opener, they'll get to the pitch part of the call, but this is where they shoot themselves in the foot. Because what most salespeople believe is that the key to being a great seller is to having a really strong pitch or a really strong value proposition, where they tell the prospect, hey, here's what we do, or here's what we are. We're the leading provider of compensation software to venture-backed companies in the Bay Area. Or when I'm selling billing software, we work with over 300 law firms to help them streamline their billing and make it more efficient. People will say pitches like that. The problem with that is if you tell your prospect, oh, we're a single pane of glass to understand your entire team's comp and when their increases are going to come, it's tough for your prospect to put that in context for what they're dealing with right now. And what we know, there's a lot of research about this that says people are more motivated to make pain and problems go away than they will be to seek benefits. And so what you need to do when you give a pitch is you should actually be pitching to the problems that you solve. And you should be describing the very, very specific problem that you think the person you are calling has, and then use your knowledge of that problem to earn an opportunity to talk about your solution. What that might sound like is, let's use that billing example for law firms. I sold billing software to law firms, and I would call CFOs of law firms. And my pitch, once they said, all right, go ahead, let's hear what you do, I'd say, great. Look, the reason that I called you is I talked to a lot of different CFOs of large insurance defense law firms. And what I hear from most of them is that they think it's pretty ridiculous that they have to deal with so many deductions, rejections, and appeals on the bills that they send to their insurance carrier clients when they bill them after they win a big case. And we work with about 300 different law firms in the US, helping them cut down on all of those appeals and rejections. And I guess I'm wondering if you might be open to learning more when I'm not totally cold calling you out of the blue. I didn't tell them how we solved that problem. I didn't give them a ton of detail. I basically said, hey, I know this problem that I think you're dealing with. We work with a lot of folks like you to cut down on that problem. Do you have any interest in even learning more? Now, very few people are going to be like, oh, let's book a meeting now. Usually you're going to be like, well, how do you actually do that? And here's where now I've opened the door to have a conversation with the prospect.
That's a great example, Nick. And I think it answers Sagar's question really well around what if somebody's already using a service you're offering, because you're actually approaching it not with your solution, but with the problem itself. So you're not even necessarily talking about your solution quite yet.
Yeah. And people will give you that rejection of, oh, I have a solution. We can talk about how we overcome objections in a second. I don't know if you want to go more in depth in terms of like the pitch, if you want to answer other questions, but we can definitely talk about objections, because you're going to get them on almost every cold call you make. Very few people are just going to be like, yep, let's book a meeting. Usually there's some resistance you'll have to overcome before that happens.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear in the chat what the number one resistance that people struggle with is. So if you want to throw that in there, maybe we can go through a few of those specific objections.
Yeah, let us know what are the biggest objections you all get on cold calls. Let us know in the chat.
And let's start with the one that was raised already as a question while some flow in. And that's, I'm already using a solution. Mm-hmm. So maybe you've gotten past that problem and you've earned the right to talk about your solution, and their objection is, well, we already have that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the mistake people try to make when they're handling objections, handling competitors, is they try to fight fire with fire, and they don't realize that most objections are reactions. It's like if you're selling any major solution, they almost always have like something in place. Yep. Something. Maybe it's an in-house solution, maybe it's spreadsheets, maybe it's a competitive solution, maybe it's a vendor, whatever it is, but they almost always have something. And so oftentimes they're just like, okay, you're trying to put a peg in the hole. Like, no, I've already got that hole filled. First thing I could think of. And so what you need to do is, instead of going and trying to pitch, you need to ask them a question that, one, creates a conversation, gets them talking, but then two, gets them to think. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do two things to get you to actually listen to me, Sophie. So if you're like, I'm already working with insert vendor here, right? So let's use the
I'm
PAVE
happy with
example,
them.
right? I'm already working, I was selling compensation software when I was running the team over at PAVE. And people would always say things like, oh, we're already working with Comptrix. Okay, cool. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to agree with the objection. And you're going to be like, what the heck? I'm going to be like, oh, Comptrix. Honestly, great group. Rarely makes sense to switch off Comptrix. And I should have assumed that you already had something in place. You're like, okay, end of the cold call? Like, that's it? Like that, you're not going to pressure. Every other telemarketer is going to boom, 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 boom. And they're going to be fighting you. And instead, I'm going to agree with the objection. And so then I'm going to ask what's called a trap question. And the way you ask the trap question, not the crap question, the way you ask the trap question is really, really important. Is I need to incentivize you to share more information. So listen closely. I say, hey, just so no one from my team calls you again, or just so we really make sure that there's nothing here, that must mean you're not doing stock option bonuses, right? Why did I ask that question? I know Comptrix doesn't manage stock option bonuses. And I know, because I pulled the right list, I'm calling venture-backed tech companies which probably have stock option bonuses. So what you do is you basically take all of your competitors and just think of one trap question for each competitor. And then the final step is, Sophie, you might be like, well, no, we are. Why? I'm going to sell the test drive, not the product. So I'm going to say, oh, well, look, like other HR teams we work with, like they oftentimes find that doing all of those stock option bonuses outside of Comptrix is a huge pain. And sometimes when you have the cash and the equity bonuses tracked separately, managers will actually ask for like a bigger salary increase because they can't see both of them together. My guess is you're probably all set, but I guess, are you open to seeing how this thing looks, just so you know it's out there? And you're going to take a look. The goal is to just get you in the car. Tesla sells a lot of cars. I don't know anyone who's ever bought a Tesla who just like didn't have a car. They usually are almost always driving a car, unless they like totaled their car and they're in this temporary state. It's usually not someone I've never driven a car before, but first time I'm buying a car is Tesla. Tesla sells a lot of rip and replace deals because they're good at getting people in the car.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that you're doing there, Armand, is you are totally removing the sales pressure that the other person feels when you agree with that objection, which creates space to actually have a conversation with them. They're like, wait, you even said, they're like, is the cold call over? Is this done? And what that does is they're no longer like, this is a sales interaction that I'm trying to get away from. They're now like, oh, okay, like, well, shoot. And that creates the space for you to ask a question and then go back in for the meeting.
Right. They're leaning into it instead. I've actually seen a similar thing to what you said there, Armand, on website conversion. So I've done a ton of website conversion data analysis around sales pipelines. And so that includes, cold calling that might spur an inbound request and so forth. But a big part of it is don't sell the product, sell the demo. Like you're selling that next step. And so by not jumping too far ahead, you can really pique their interest and take them along the journey. Now, just being, oh, sorry, Nick, go for it.
The only thing that I would add to your point there. So you remove the sales pressure in the immediate response to the objection. Armand was like, oh, shoot, they're an awesome group. Like I should have figured you had something in place. That lowers sales pressure and makes them more willing to talk with you. You're also going to do that on the back half of selling the test drive, where when you ask for the meeting again, you'll lower pressure by saying stuff like, look, like you're probably not going to buy this thing right now, but open to taking a look just so you get a sense of what's out there. Or, it usually doesn't make sense to switch from Compex, but like every now and then it happens. I guess, would you be open to taking a look? And in worst case scenario, we can give you a quote just to make sure you keep the other folks honest. What I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, you're probably not going to buy this thing. It doesn't always make sense to switch, but are you open to taking a look anyway? And what happens is your prospect is considering, do they want to take a meeting with you? And your prospect doesn't want to take a meeting with someone who's going to be rah, let me pressure you into moving off of Compex. When you say these statements of like, hey, you probably won't switch, doesn't mean you're not going to sell in the meeting, but you're showing them this is not a punch them in the face, high pressure sales meeting that they are signing up for if they say yes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you're actually giving them value because you're giving them a quote. You're educating them overall on their solutions. So you kind of flipped it on its head. I love that, Nick. Now, I want to squeeze in one last kind of objection question before we flip over, and that it's pain is not too urgent. And it's a common thing. Can you manufacture pain, or is that an indication that maybe that's just not the right buyer?
Yeah. Pain is really challenging to manufacture, but it is easy to find and amplify. Not easy, but if you can find it, you can amplify it. And so oftentimes what we would do is I used to sell, many of you probably heard, for better or for worse, a company called Carta. Carta helps companies manage their equity, stock option packages, their cap tables. And also every single year, in order to have a stock option plan, you need to get a valuation every single year. And so that valuation resets every single year. So when you're cold calling, oftentimes we had a strategy that was called a timeline pivot. And so we would lead with the problem we solve, and managing your cap table is a huge pain. We automate many parts of your cap table, the issuance of stock options, your valuations, all that stuff. So you never have to manage cap tables and spreadsheets again. They'd say like, that sounds all great, but it's not like a huge problem right now. Or like, we don't have a ton of change in our cap table right now. And so I would always pivot to, oh, well, look, I noticed your next valuation date is in 6 months there. I guess, how are you going about doing that? Or if the valuation was too far, I would have my next thing, which is I notice most of the time companies will do stock options in quarterly batches. And I think we're coming up on Q2, and I'm curious, it looks like you've hired some employees over there. How do you plan to issue your next batch of 10 stock options for those new hires? And so if not that, there was another one, which is like, oh, I know we're coming up on, the quarterly expense accounting reporting. I'm curious, how are you managing that? And so you want to have 2 or 3 things that you can use to like pull the thing back. But the reality is, oftentimes on a cold call, that's actually not the real issue. People are usually just saying, call me in 6 months, because they're busy and they don't really like want to deal with a cold call. And that's when you need to go back to actually just like getting them to think about a problem at all and convincing them to take a test drive, not for now, but for later.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. So take them at a different stage of the funnel.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, we had a few questions in the chat. I know I threw an answer in there just around the PDF that you had up, Armand, and a few questions around the book. Where can people purchase the book, or what can they expect from the book? What are the dates? Give us the details around the book, because that PDF was actually, I believe, a screenshot of the PDF of the book. Correct me
That
if
was
I'm
the
wrong there,
book.
Armand.
Yeah. So you could have
Love it.
screenshot it. You can probably
He's
go
giving it away for free. Look at
Give it
this.
away for free.
The best
Uh-huh.
salesperson in the world.
So the best thing about doing these types of webinars, these events, are, folks, if you like what you saw here, this is literally what the book is we broke down every single step of the cold call one by one. So it starts with, why is cold calling worth it at all, in the introduction? Then it goes into openers. Actually, here, I'll just show you one more thing. This is actually my favorite thing. I do a lot of drawings and whatnot within the book. And so if
I saw some Pokemon cards in there, Armand.
Yeah, there's Pokemon cards in here. I suppose someone could like really slow scroll that and like figure out a way to screenshot every single page that I just scrolled over. So if you want to do that, power to you. You earn the book. But it breaks down every part of the cold call step by step. The different openers, the problems we solve. Then it goes through objections, how to handle gatekeepers and voicemails. And then we go through metrics, connect rates, set rates, show rates, how to improve each of them, how to structure your day, all that stuff. And so it's honestly a step-by-step guide to calling strangers, which is the subtitle of the book. And along the way, we support all of this stuff with talk tracks that you can steal. There are audio clips and voiceovers sprinkled throughout the book. So you can literally like scan parts of the talk tracks and hear how they sound. And we also partnered with Gong to get data to support all of the advice too, so you know it actually works. So if you liked what you saw here, our goal is to create the most actionable cold calling book of all time, and you can get it at 30mpc.com/book.
Beautiful. And I did pop it in the chat there, but I know we've had a lot of comments, so it'll be buried. We'll send a follow-up email with the recording and that link if anyone is interested. As part of this, we did want to do a little bit of a giveaway for the book itself to a random registrant. We've run it on our team through a random registry. And the winner they pulled was Fred Callis. I don't actually know if he's on the call right now.
Fred, are you here? I don't know.
Fred, are you
Let us know, Fred. Congrats, Fred.
We've got a hand raised. So Fred's actually live.
Oh, no, we got Fred. Let's go.
All right,
For
Fred,
you.
so we'll send you an email following up, but I know I've kind of got a sneak peek. Now we've all got a sneak peek of the book. It's just going to be fabulous. It's packed with actionable tactical takeaways from actual operators in the trenches too. Most importantly, it's a big premise behind GTM Now. We're the media brand of GTM Fund, and we are sharing insights on kind of actual operators in the trenches who know and have built SaaS companies just like Armand and Nick. So really appreciate the time, Armand and Nick. Where can people find you? I know we've talked about the book, but if you recommend anyone getting in touch with you, what's the best way?
Yeah. We're both on LinkedIn. You got something to share? You looked like you were going to share something. Huh.
Well, you got that. Follow us on LinkedIn. We post all of our personal content on LinkedIn, and every week in our newsletter, we do a roll-up of every piece of content we've put out. So the best LinkedIn post, the best podcast, the best webinars, all that stuff. And we do a weekly write-up that's like a tactical breakdown on one topic: discovery calls, negotiation, sales, leadership, whatever it is. And so we usually recommend starting there for 30 minutes to President's Club. So start on the newsletter, and it's just 30mpc.com/newsletter.
Amazing. Wonderful. Well, thank you for the time today. Thank you for sharing a little bit on the book itself, the newsletter, which you just dropped in the chat, and excited for the book launch. Got it in the calendar.
Woohoo.
Oh,
thanks everybody.
Sophie. Y'all do great stuff.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.